You kind of got your start in San Francisco, is that right? As a political community activist?
I actually joined what was then called Gay Liberation
Mhm.
back in 1972 in Phoenix, Arizona. It was very conservative then, as it is today. And I read in magazines about a lot of gay people living in San Francisco. So one day I had enough of Arizona and I hitchhiked up to San Francisco and was extremely fortunate in meeting some of the real pioneers of our movement then.
Of course, one of them being Harvey Milk.
That is correct. I met Harvey Milk early on, and I didn't take him very seriously. He was a funny guy. He had a long hair and a ponytail. He was kind of a hippie. Um, but I decided I wanted to see the world, and so I managed to get a cheap flight to Europe, and I spent the better part of 1975, 76, and 1977 hitchhiking around Europe and the Middle East. And as it happened, I was in Barcelona, Spain, for the very first Gay Pride March. It was shortly after Franco had died. And I was quite inspired by that. And I was corresponding with Harvey and telling him about my adventures, seeking out evidence of this, what was then still a very, very new young movement. And when I got back to San Francisco, I learned that Harvey had had some of my letters published in the local gay newspaper, and that helped me get me started.
Yes, you're sort of coming out as an activist, maybe. And there's a great scene in the film about Harvey Milk's life, the documentary, where I think it's a longshoreman or a teamster, and he's talking about how he was so impressed that Harvey Milk was able to get the gay bars in San Francisco to boycott Coors beer, and so kind of linking the labor movement and the LGBT plus movement. And I'm wondering about how you got your start bridging those sort of two movements.
Well, when I got back from Europe in 1977, the Coors boycott was in full swing, and a Teamster organizer named Alan Baird, who'd grown up in the Castro and was one of those original inhabitants who actually welcomed the influx of mostly gay men to the neighborhood. So Alan approached Harvey and asked him if he would support the Coors boycott and support the workers. And Harvey, of course, immediately saw the opportunity there. He saw an opportunity for a union to back us, which had not happened. There were no alliances between labor unions and what we now call LGBTQ, LGBT plus, whatever. Um, so Harvey saw a unique moment in history, and he seized that moment and made a deal with the Teamsters to say, yes, we will get Coors beer out of the gay market, but we want you to stand up for gay workers and help us get jobs. And I think one thing that has been forgotten now, happily forgotten by the younger generation, is that we're talking about a time when it was still illegal to be gay in most of the world, and certainly most of the United States. And so getting and keeping a job was a real challenge. There were no protections really at all against discrimination or abuse or harassment at the workplace. So Harvey correctly saw that as a great opportunity. And Alan Baird, the Teamster who was central in building that coalition, is actually still alive and still a very dear friend of mine. I think it's also important to understand that the cooperation between the Teamsters Union and our community opened the door for further collaboration, which would become incredibly important just a couple years later, when in California, there was an effort to make it illegal for gay people and our supporters to work in any capacity within the public school system. This was a really serious attack, not just on gay people, but on workers, on school workers, on teachers' aides, custodial staff, people that work in the schools. So that that beginning of an alliance that had been nurtured with Harvey and the Teamsters then grew into a much more robust cooperation between the teachers' unions, the service employees' unions, and the community.
Well, a really great example of the kind of taking the long view and thinking about building those solid coalitions, and not just in a kind of quickly transactional way, but for the long haul.
Absolutely.
Hmm. And where so how did you end up as an organizer at Unite Here, or did you have an entrance with another union, or did you start at Unite Here?
No, I had been pursuing a political career, which was, cut short by HIV/AIDS. By 1985, I think almost everyone I knew was dead or dying or caring for someone who was dying. So all of my efforts and almost everyone I knew, were engaged in trying to stop the epidemic and to force the government to take more action and spend more money and do more research and trying to educate my brothers about this new terrible threat. Um, it was perceived at that point primarily as a disease of white gay men. And that was, of course, a terrible error. And one of the things I point out is that if you want to explore the consequences of homophobia and transphobia, I would add, the one should look at the AIDS pandemic and the deaths of tens of millions of heterosexual men and women and children who lost their lives because of this false perception of HIV as only a disease of white gay men. And that reality is particularly acute and tragic when we look at sub-Saharan Africa, for example. So, but I was always a union supporter. Those were core values of my family. I learned as a small child that one does never crosses a picket line, and I was taught by my parents and my grandparents that unions gave workers power, and they spoke of unions in a very sort of practical way. They weren't romanticizing it. They were just simply telling me if workers have a union, they get paid better. They have safer working conditions. They have access to health care, and they're treated with a little more respect and dignity on the job. So no one needed to persuade me that the labor movement was important. But I fell into this new role really quite by accident when a very prominent HIV/AIDS organization here in the United States decided to go ahead with their annual conference in a hotel where there was a labor struggle and a boycott. So the workers at this particular hotel had asked the community to stay out. And, whenever we have to ask people to make these kinds of sacrifices, it's always a challenge. But in this case, it was ironic that this organization, which was supposedly focused on increasing access to health care in the fight against AIDS for, in particular, people of color. But the union, that's what we do. We get health care for people of color because our union is overwhelmingly made up of particularly women of color, immigrant women, and that's a key part of our campaigns is fighting for health care. So I was very angered that this HIV/AIDS organization would violate boycott and disrespect the workers and disrespect the union and ignore the call for solidarity. So I wrote a angry editorial about it, and then the next thing I know, I'm being asked to come to Washington D.C. to meet with our international union president at the time, named John Wilhelm. And they were gearing up for a major campaign with hotels across the United States and Canada And I pointed out that very, large numbers of our people work within this industry, and also that all of the big hotel corporations, some of the largest corporations in the world, marketed directly to especially gay men and lesbian women. Um, so that sort of set the stage, and basically I just kind of created a program around this and started visiting our local affiliates across the United States and Canada to begin that conversation at every level of our organization. And it's been uh, an often confusing process, but I think it's really helped strengthen our union and build protections for LGBTQ workers.
Mm, excellent. And the Know Who You Sleep With campaign.
You have to, excuse me, you have to get it right. It's called Sleep with the Right People. We want people to stay in hotels that respect their workers. If you're going to spend the night in a hotel, if you're going to eat in a hotel, if you're going to have a conference in a hotel, then please choose a hotel that has a union contract. And so this is a small part of a much larger campaign called Fair Hotels. And we have websites where travelers and event planners can go and see which hotels in those cities have union contracts and respect their workers.
Excellent. And this sort of ongoing relationship and coalition building, even if informally, with the LGBT community is very, very important. It's in many countries in the global north, the LGBT plus community is considered sort of have a lot of there's an assumption or presumption that they have a lot of disposable income, and so, as you said, corporations market to them. They also increasingly sell diversity as part of their the way they present themselves to the world, and they encourage some employee organizing within the corporation. And how do you see that as a development? Is that something we should be wary of? Because I mean, these corporations ultimately they're about money.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know what words are used to describe these efforts in other countries, but here in the United States, it's called DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And there's almost every big corporation now has a department or maybe even a vice president for diversity, which costs them nothing and allows them to present this face to the public that says, oh, yes, we're all about diversity and inclusion. But the E part, the equity, is rarely made evident. So, yes, it's a good thing that corporations are acknowledging their LGBTQ employees, but it's a better thing when they increase their pay and provide health insurance and safe working conditions. So I think in some ways this movement for DEI has been a gift to the employers who can, uh, you know, put their pronouns at the bottom of their emails and think that that's all they need to do. Well, no, that's not all they need to do. They need to step up. And it's very important that we be clear about this and that we want more than acknowledgement. We want more than soft words. We want better pay. We want corporations to show respect for these workers, not just with words, but with actions and paychecks and health care.
Now, with all the progress and incredible, like, hard-won accomplishments that LGBT plus folks have seen, say in the United States over your lifetime, um, things are looking pretty dark right now in lots of parts of the United States. How do you feel about that?
Well, I've been doing this work for over 50 years now, and it is quite remarkable the changes I've seen within my lifetime. when I started, it never occurred to me. It never occurred to me that I would see a day when same-sex couples could be married and have their relationship recognized by our federal government. That honestly was so far away from reality that I don't think it was even on anybody's list of things we wanted back in 1972. Back in 1972, we didn't want to get beaten up. We didn't want to be arrested. We didn't want to have to go to bars and back alleys that were run by the mafia. Uh, so yes, there's been real progress, but it could all be swept away in the blink of an eye. And I think the election of Donald Trump a few years ago just proves that we must always be vigilant. We must always be organizing. We must always be prepared to fight. We can never take anything for granted. So right now we have a Supreme Court in the United States that has taken from women the right to control their own bodies. And we're seeing that across the country, the more conservative states are acting rapidly and aggressively to seize that moment and force women back to a very bad era. And that can happen to us, and in some places is happening to us. And I think for me, this makes the work with the unions even so much more important because there's all sorts of people in my country who are terrified by the emergence of outright fascism. And I know that we have siblings, brothers and sisters, family all across the planet in many, many countries who are also fighting to defend democracy and to hold back what is clearly a fascistic tendency that is gaining power. But we are fragmented and we are divided and we are all working in our little areas and focused on our own particular struggle. But the labor movement is where we all come together. And in my country, the labor movement is probably the only place where people of many different colors and ethnicities and genders and orientations come together, find their common ground, and engage in the larger, broader struggle for peace and social justice. So we have a lot of work ahead of us. We've won many victories. They can all be undone. And we need to be strong and we need to understand and offer the example of what we can do when we have solidarity.
Well, that's such an inspiring message for our listeners, and particularly because we do have a global audience, and as you said, there are folks who are at a stage in the struggle locally, in their communities and their workplaces where that is very hostile to LGBT plus folks. And often very hostile to trade unions, and so it's both useful to see that there is hope, but also to understand that we need to be vigilant.
Yes, absolutely.
Now, let me ask you a different sort of question, which is what what do you really care about? What gets you up in the morning these days?
Well, I'm getting old and I've had a lot of health issues. I recently was diagnosed with cancer and had to go through quite a bit with that, which brought back a lot of memories of the bad days of living with HIV. But I still, I just love it when I see ordinary people working together and finding common ground. And sometimes we find it in unexpected places. Um, I recently lost my apartment in San Francisco. The gay neighborhoods in all of North America and much of Europe and Australia are going away. These geographic concentrations that gave us political power and cultural vitality and the ability to provide specialized social services to the most vulnerable among us, these enclaves are being dispersed largely by greedy developers and investors. That's what happened to me. And so I ended up in the country. I'm living in a very different place. It's only a 90-minute drive to San Francisco, but it might as well be another state. And it's been very interesting to me to meet and come to know people in this rural community who are mostly white, mostly heterosexual, and many of them are very, very conservative. But we find common ground. The cost of housing here is going through the roof. We have threats of fire and flood. We have to work together as communities. So whenever I see people really building communities, finding solidarity, tackling those problems that affect all of us except the very rich, then I feel glad and grateful to be alive and part of this movement. It gives me hope.
That's said like a true organizer about bringing people from disparate backgrounds together and finding common ground for sure. Um, I'm wondering if you might offer some advice to our listeners who are struggling within their union, trying to build some structures within their union, or trying to move their union toward being more inclusive. Is there some advice you might offer?
Well, I can only speak from my own experience with my own union. Unions are structured in different ways. Unions have different rules about how we organize internally. In my union, we don't have caucuses. Um, and in my union, and I think many other unions, we have a great many people, loyal union members, hardworking people, passionate about the movement, who also hold, have very deeply held religious beliefs that have taught them that homosexuality is sinful. It, Early on in my work with Unite Here, a big part of what we were doing was simply getting all of our local affiliates to provide a time and a space for people to talk about this. And at the beginning, it was very difficult. There were tears. People shouted and cried, and some people never changed their mind, but many more did. And so much of this goes back to what Harvey Milk used to say to the people we now call LGBTQ plus. He said, "You must come out. You must come out, because when people know us, when they know that they know us, when they know that we are in their families, when they know that they work with us, that we're in the same neighborhood, then they they don't fear us, they don't hate us, and they don't fight to take away our rights." And so at workplaces and in union halls, this conversation has to be continued and move forward. And I think it also requires a fair amount of patience. I've got to assume that, uh, I mean, I am not, I do not, I am not a religious person, but I have to assume that these workers in my union who are Muslim or Catholic or Protestant or Jewish or whatever, um, they believe in justice. And so sometimes it can be quite exasperating, and one struggles to find the right words and the right strategy to reach them. But if you do that with patience and respect, I think that the rewards for that are quite significant. And in my union, we've seen, I have seen it myself. I have seen people who told me that they could not support LGBTQ workers because we were sinners. And I have seen them change their minds, and I have seen them reach out and embrace their queer and trans coworkers. And I have seen it here out in the country now too, uh, in some rather remarkable ways.
Well, that's a very positive note to end on. I want to really, really thank you for joining us, and it was fascinating to hear from you. And I'm very honored to have met you virtually, perhaps one day in person. So thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you all. Solidarity.